Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the 7Artisans 35mm F0.95 lens. Now, this is a lens that is designed for a number of different camera systems, including Sony E-mount, APS-C, which I'm reviewing here, Fuji X-mount, Canon EF-M, then also Micro Four Thirds, and even Nikon Z-mount, in the DX or crop format. And so obviously you've got a lot of flexibility as to where this lens can be used, though you do need to buy it in the appropriate mount for your camera system. But lenses like this are intriguing in that they offer up a lot of creative opportunities at a reasonable price. In this case, this lens only retails for $249 US, which obviously is a lot of lens in terms of maximum aperture for your money. The question, of course, always is that while that looks great on paper, how does the lens perform in reality? Often lenses with a very large maximum aperture are just too compromised optically for my taste. They have too many aberrations. They're, kind of soft, hazy, dreamy, whatever euphemism you want to use. But the reality is that you typically with such lenses have to stop them down to smaller maximum apertures to get reasonable image quality. And by that point, the whole reason for having that larger maximum aperture is lost. Fortunately, that's really not the case here. This lens is a surprisingly competent lens if you use it in the right situation, as we're going to explore. So first of all, we're going to jump in and give you a closer look at build, design, what's here, what's not here. Let's jump in and let's take a look. So the first thing that stands out here is that there's some heft to this lens. It's all metal and glass, and of course there's a lot of glass with a maximum aperture of f0.95. And so a huge aperture, lots of glass elements inside, and then all metal and construction. The lens, as you can see, is really quite compact. It is only 63 millimeters in diameter, and then even shorter, 56 millimeters in length, giving us a 52 millimeter front filter thread. But the overall weight is 369 grams, which in an absolute sense is not heavy, but for a lens this compact, there's definitely some heft to it. The lens has an attractive kind of almost black chrome accent ring right here, which I think is a nice additional finish. The lens mount itself is sturdy looking. You can tell it's a fixed rear group here that doesn't move, and so you do want to be careful there. But the good news is that while there's no weather sealing, there's also not a lot of room there for anything to get inside of the lens. Also no electronics, however, so there's going to be no XF information. You're not going to automatically know for example, a stabilization. If you have a camera body with stabilization, you're going to have to manually input that focal length. And by the way, I tend to, with APS-C lenses, if you're happening to shoot on a full frame, and you're shooting in Super 35 mode, I tend to put in the full frame equivalent, just get a little bit better stabilization results. So for this lens, I would choose 50 millimeters, which I think is more appropriate to what you're actually trying to stabilize. So as you can see, you have distance markings here along with hyperfocal markings. I'm a little leery sometimes of hyperfocal markings on lenses like this. You're going to have to kind of test your copy and get accustomed to where to focus. I prefer, however, to just visually confirm a focus where I want it to be, and rather than trusting to hyperfocal markings on that. There's not necessarily a lot of room for error sometimes with hyperfocal, and I find that I tend to get better focus results by just making sure focus is where I want it to be. The focus ring itself, however, though, is nicely damped. Everything moves smoothly. You can see that this is not an internally focusing lens. There is a small amount of extension there, but it doesn't radically change. It's not going to change enough, for example, if you're on a gimbal to offset your balance, I don't think. The focus throw is, in my estimation, it's about 115 degrees, and so enough for precision and not too long. Up front we have a manual aperture ring, and it is declicked. It moves nice and smoothly, and as you can see, that 12-bladed aperture is really gorgeous as it opens and closes as you smooth along. So aperture racking, definitely easy to do, and of course for video work, the nice weight and damping of the focus ring is going to make it generally a joy to use. Up front, we do have rather than a pinch cap, we have an over-the-top fitting. There's kind of a velvet inside that helps along with suction. So far, I haven't had any problem with it coming off. I suspect you won't have a problem with it either. All in all, we've got a nicely built lens here. Everything constructed here is very solid, feels very nicely made. Lots of lens for only 249 bucks. So as you can see, a lot of really good things here when it comes to the build. It really is beautifully made. Handling, I think, is very good, outside of the fact that you don't have some of the niceties that you do with some lenses. Not having any electronic communication means that, for example, on the Sony body that I tested, you're not going to get focus assist, where you start to magnify a portion of the image automatically when you start to focus. So that means you're going to have to manually magnify if you have your camera set up to do that. You can still use things like focus overlays, focus peaking to help you with focus, but those things are a little bit less automated, and you're not going to get any kind of in-camera profiling. Though, as we're going to see in a moment, fortunately that's really not all that big a deal because there are no major aberrations when it comes to distortion or vignette that need radical amounts of correction. So maybe not as big a factor there, though as always I do miss not having appropriate EXIF data, which means that if you use a number of lenses like this, it can be hard going back into your catalog to distinguish which lens was which. And for myself as a tester, I'm having to rely on memory most of the time to tell you what aperture I used at the time of a particular shot, because I don't have that information available to me. Now, as it comes to the actual focus of the lens, I had good results with that. I do use a focus overlay, and so I can do that. And then if it's a critical situation, I'll magnify in and visually confirm focus. So no, major concerns on that front from me personally. As long as I have the time to be deliberate, I actually enjoy shooting with a lens like this, but it's certainly not as practical. For example, I mixed in a little bit for a few portrait shots. And while the results are fine, it's a much slower, more painful process to pull that out, and you have to have some patience from your model, because it's very different than most other lenses now where you have IAF and you can shoot off a lot of frames in a very short amount of time with just your model just moving around a little bit, but IAF and quick autofocus just really simplifies that. Going to be much more deliberate when you shoot like this, so you really have to shoot according to that style. So what kind of results can you expect? Let's jump in and let's take a look at the image quality in detail here. So let's start by taking a look at both our distortion and our vignette, neither of which is really much of an issue. You can see there is a very minor amount of barrel distortion here. It also, though, goes in a nice linear fashion to where the bulge is right towards the center, and it kind of tapers off towards the edges with no dip towards the edge, so not hard to correct. Vignette is surprisingly not too bad for such a huge maximum aperture lens. We'll find out why in just a second. So you can see here I was able to manually correct for the vignette and distortion without any kind of real complication, by using a +5 on the distortion slider and then a +53 and moving the midpoint all the way over to the left. And so we're correcting for somewhere right around maybe a little under 2 stops of vignette in the corner. So you can see the APS-C crop on the left side. You can see how the lens frames on full frame. Unlike a lot of APS-C lenses, you can tell that this is covering a larger than APS-C image circle. You can see that there is mechanical vignette in the corners, but it doesn't extend far into the frame. So if I were to just crop off the mechanical vignette, which I've done here on the right, you can see that still enables me to have a much wider crop than what we see with the APS-C crop. And so that helps to explain why the vignette is quite low, for such a large maximum aperture. And that's because this lens actually covers a little bit more than the APS-C image circle, probably closer to APS-C or APS-H, which is around a 1.3 times crop factor. Not that there's really any cameras that have that mount and that crop factor that you could put this lens on. So wide open, you can see that there's definitely a fair amount of longitudinal chromatic aberration to be expected really for a lens like this. Stopping down a bit to the, not quite 1.4 range, maybe 1.2, 1.3, we can see that the fringing does diminish, but doesn't entirely disappear either with a mild stop down. You'll have to stop down further than that to actually eliminate all the longitudinal chromatic aberrations. We can also see that there is some lateral chromatic aberration along the edge of the frame. It's not extreme necessarily, but it's definitely visible here. And so you can see it pop up on, where it should be just black and then white. You can definitely see that fringing is there. So as expected, those aberrations do play a little bit of havoc with our wide open contrast. You can actually see there's even at f0.95, there is a fair amount of detail that's there, but it is obscured a bit by just kind of a generalized haze over the top of things. A little bit of a stop down to slightly over f1, f1.2, that range. You can see that the contrast starts to improve, but it's still not great. In the middle of the frame, we can see that there's not a huge drop off from the center, but you can see there's definitely some lower contrast. Contrast starts to improve as you stop it down a bit. In the corners wide open, there's not a lot of acuity, as you can see. Everything's just pretty much smeared. Stopping down increases contrast, but we still don't have a lot of resolution to work with here in the corner, with everything still kind of smeared and not a lot of rendering of fine detail there. If we stop on down to the f2 range, you can see that while there still are some aberrations, our contrast and resolution is really sharpening up very nicely in the center of the frame. That's a lot of resolution there. In the mid frame, it is also looking quite good and definitely vastly improved in mid frame. In the corners, things are starting to get better and that contrast is good, and you can see that the details are starting to resolve without everything looking kind of rough, without any distinguishing of the fine texture. You can see that that is starting to improve, though not exceptional. At f2.8, fine detail is starting to improve, and in a lot of places it's looking better. And by f4, the corners are looking pretty good. Not exceptional, but quite good. And our mid-frame now looks exceptional. And looking over here, the center looks fantastically sharp. There's a slight bit more improvement if you stop on down to f5.6 in the corner. And that's pretty much where we're going to top out. A little bit more brightness, a little bit sharper at f8, but fairly similar to what we saw at f5.6. Now, if you use the lens in the sweet spot, even at f0.95, I actually found that I was surprised by how much resolution and contrast I got in real-world use. And so as you can see here, this is wide open. You can see that there's quite a lot that is rendered there. Now, if I had composed into the corner, we wouldn't see nearly this high of resolution, but for practical use, the way you're actually going to use the lens, it actually does surprisingly well, and I think it's useful at the maximum aperture. Here's another image that illustrates the point. I mean, looking at the chess piece here, I actually think it looks really quite nice. There's not any obvious fringing that's destroying things. Textures look quite good. And of course, transitioning towards defocus is really quite nice. Here's another real-world shot, I think at maximum aperture. And you can see that in this case, it's not quite as impressive as it is up close, where I think the lens is more optimized, but at the same time things look quite good, and contrast globally looks quite excellent, really. So you can focus down to 37 centimeters, and that gives us somewhere near a 0.15 times, it looks like, magnification. Now, surprisingly, it actually performs really strong, and so again I'm reminded that this lens seems to be optimized for up-close performance. And so I'm actually surprised by how good it looks there in the center of the frame, but even throughout this range, it's actually really impressive. And if you stop it down a bit, as you can see, things get better still. So up-close performance is really quite good. Our performance at infinity is more of a mixed bag. I didn't find that the lens liked harsh lighting situations as well, but in this case I felt like the center portion of the frame looks really good. You can see good contrast at landscape apertures, a lot of fine detail rendered. As you move towards the edge of the frame though, that really starts to become lost. And so you can see there's a transition to where that sharp zone begins to be lost. And so if you call it field curvature or just basic performance, the reality is that at landscape apertures, you're going to want to shoot at probably f8, and even so, don't expect pin sharp corners necessarily. Now, taking a quick look at the bokeh quality, wide open here, you can see that bokeh circles are really nice, big and soft. Fringing is not too bad here in the highlights. You can see the geometry, it does trend, trend towards the kind of lemon shape in the edges, but certainly not the worst that I've seen. Stopping down, we get very quickly, even at f1.4, really nice circular shapes all across the frame. And of course, the 12-bladed aperture helps to maintain a very circular shape as you stop on down. That's a very impressive part of the performance. So the combination of strong up-close performance and then very nice bokeh rendering really allows this lens to shine in this kind of situation, which, by the way, is a way I really love to use lenses like this, in that you have really gorgeous rendering here. You've got good detail on your subject, and the image looked at globally is just really pleasing. Another example here, even though it's a busier scene, at the same time, I think that all of this kind of busyness has been handled fairly artistically, and contrast and detail looks really good here in this up-close shot. And even stepping back a little ways here, it's more like a meter to the subject, maybe a bit further. You can see that detail still looks pretty good, and even though, again, we're getting busier still because we're changing the ratio of distance from the camera to the subject to the background, even so, I think that it's handled this scene fairly well, and overall, I mean, that's it's a nice looking image for, again, the amount of money you're paying for this lens. Now, where the lens doesn't shine is when it comes to flare resistance, and kind of depending on where you position the sun, there's a certain spot that I managed to catch here where you just get this huge kind of veiling spot where contrast is completely lost. The rest of the image is kind of surprising because contrast isn't bad everywhere else, but there's this kind of blob here. And other positions, you will see some ghosting artifacts. And then if we pan back and forth, you can see what I mean, that it's really inconsistent as far as flare resistance. It really depends on where the sun is positioned. That's true wide open and stop down, as you can see here. Though in stop down, we can see a more defined ghosting pattern more consistently in our images. So while there are some optical flaws there, as I expected with a lens with such a large maximum aperture, I actually find the end results to be very useful, particularly in the way that I do like to use a lens like this. I mean, you really don't buy an f0.95 lens as a landscape lens. Not to say you can't shoot landscapes with it, but really use that aperture. Shoot at wide apertures and get the kind of creative images you can get from a lens like that. And so using it in that style, I actually really like the look of images coming off of it. There definitely are some aberrations there, but they weren't really destructive in a lot of images that I shot, and so I actually felt like this was a better performance than I'm accustomed to seeing with lenses that have very large maximum apertures like this. This is not a great season for me right now for shooting video with something like this, and I'm really more of, as you know, a photography first person, but I can see this also being a very valuable lens for, a filmmaker that's on a budget, because it will give you really creative options with depth of field, some things to play with that I think will be really visually intriguing. And so for $249, this is a very low risk, potentially high reward kind of lens. And while often lenses with huge maximum apertures are kind of too compromised optically for me to love them, I don't feel that way about this lens. This is a lens that I could see myself actually using when the kind of creative urge hit me. If you look in the description down below, there is linkage to a mini review / image gallery, so you can check out photos that I've taken with the lens. There's also buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. Beyond that, there is linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, sign up for my newsletter that comes out every Thursday, even a place to get some of my recent merch that's just now coming out for this channel. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Be sure to ring that bell and so you get notifications when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.